Hello there, my name's Dr. Pete Bridge. I'm currently the Editor-in-Chief for the Journal of Radiotherapy in Practice, and in my day job I'm a Senior Lecturer in Therapeutic Radiography at the University of Liverpool. This presentation is designed to give you a bit of information about peer review, with the hope that when you come and do peer reviews for our journal, you've got a little bit of knowledge and understanding and some guidance as to what's expected. So I'll start this presentation by talking through the rationale for peer review. Why is it so important in relation to the evidence base in whatever subject you are interested in? I'll then talk through the peer review process as a sort of overview, and then move into the guidance. That's most of what I'm going to be talking about in this session. What you should be looking for in each stage and in each section of the manuscript. I'll then talk a little bit about the very important aspect of peer review, which is making the decision, and what each of those actually means in terms of the author, the editorial process, and making sure that it links with the final section, which is writing the feedback. So first of all, why engage in peer review? We know it takes time and effort to do it, so why engage with it? There are many benefits associated with peer reviewing. I've been peer reviewing for many years now, and it's certainly helped me to stay in touch with what's happening as regards research in my profession. So as a CPD activity, it really is first class. As well as that, it helps you to develop higher level skills, so your critical evaluation skills, making sure that you get used to looking at evidence, reading evidence, thinking about the positives and the less positive aspects of what you're reading. As well as that, it's a really good tool for helping you hone your own writing skills, and reading lots and lots of manuscripts and identifying what could be improved in them is a really good way of preparing you for writing your own and getting into publishing your own papers. And finally, it's good. It broadens your horizons in terms of looking at different topics, different perspectives, and introducing you to methods and methodologies that perhaps you're not previously familiar with. Now, from a journal perspective, peer review is absolutely core to our daily business. So we need to make sure that the manuscripts that we publish have got good reliability, good validity, and are able to improve current practice. And in our sphere of activity, we want to improve practice in radiotherapy. So an important part of this process for us is that some fresh pair of eyes are able to have a look at the methods and see if there's been any misinterpretation or any bias introduced even at the method stage. Hopefully being able to look at the credibility and the reliability of the method used, and making sure that the right process has been undertaken. Checking the ethics, very important aspect of it. That's something we'll do as editors, but also having that perspective from our reviewers is really important. Finally, we obviously need to make sure that our work not only is high quality and valid with implications for practice, but also that people can read it well. And an important part of the process isn't necessarily going through and proofreading and highlighting every spelling mistake, but hopefully providing an overview of where the manuscript could be clarified and where we could have perhaps better organisation and improve the overall flow of the manuscript so that a range of different readers are able to access it and gain from the findings. In wider terms, peer review has great benefits to the profession. It's a really good way of opening up dialogue between different people who might otherwise not have met or engaged with each other. So enabling this process of both providing constructive criticism, both providing feedback, allows different professionals to collaborate. As well as that, it makes sure that we are constantly focusing on not only looking at the novel, the exciting parts of research, but also focusing all of that research attention on the impact of it. Making sure that the findings from published work is always going to be relevant and applicable. And of course, as I said before, making sure that we adhere to appropriate ethical standards in research and publication. So the peer review process. It all starts when you get your invitation. And the key to making sure that you're invited to review something that you're interested in and know things about is to make sure that we have the right data about you. So when we choose a reviewer to look at a manuscript, we'll first of all match to see if your personal classifications match those related to the content of the manuscript. So if they're not up to date or relevant, then you're going to be sent irrelevant papers. It's as simple as that. So typically we allow around 4 weeks to review. We can extend that if you've got other things on. That's not a massive problem. The biggest challenge we face, though, and the biggest delay in our review process is that we do ask that you accept or decline the review as soon as you get it. So if you think, this is something I could do, just accept it straight away. If you think you're not going to be able to, decline it straight away. And the reason why that's so important is the system will automatically choose another reviewer if you decline it. If you don't decline it or you don't accept it, it'll assume you're still thinking about it. And that introduces another week's delay before we can even start to invite any more reviewers. So that initial response to invitation really needs to be acted on as soon as possible. The other thing is if you are interested but you don't get round to accepting it, the time will run out and you'll be automatically uninvited, which sounds jolly rude, but that's just the way the system works. So once you've been invited to review, you have a look at the paper and you review it, and then you submit your decision and some comments that hopefully match that decision and will aid either revision or inform the author why the paper has not been accepted. So typically then the editor will look at 2 independent reviews and hopefully the decisions will match. That rarely happens. So a little bit of negotiation there, and it's possible that we'll invite a 3rd reviewer in the cases where we can't get that decision to be made. The author's then informed and asked to revise a manuscript, and we like to try and invite the same people to look at revisions who suggested a revision in the first place, and that just speeds it up. You're already familiar with the paper, you can see the comments you made, and hopefully you can identify how the author has addressed them. So what do you do when you're actually doing the review? One of the first things to do really is just have a look at the paper, the manuscript as an overview. So know the format for the journal, that's all there on our web page, and make sure that the authors are adhering to it. Now, an initial check will always be done by the editor, the assigned editor, so hopefully they'll have dealt with all of that, but it's still good to make sure that the format is correct for the type of paper you're looking at, be that quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods, a review. We've got educational notes and case studies, and we've got a new protocol, and all of those are slightly different in their requirements for length of manuscript, for the references, for how we structure things. So do make sure that you're applying the right guidance for the right format of submission. So the title should be clear and concise. If someone reads the title, they should know roughly what to expect in the paper. The abstract for us is very short, and it's got to be structured in that the background, the aim, method, results and conclusion. So it has to be very clear and very concise and just provide a very brief taster of what's included, and that must include some results so that somebody can read the abstract and go, all right, I see they've actually got some data and a relevant conclusion drawn from that. So moving on to the introduction now, a very common error we find in submitted manuscripts is that there's insufficient support from the evidence base. So part of the reason why we send the manuscripts out to people who are experts in their field or interested in that field is that they're probably going to have a good understanding of what literature should be out there and should be relevant to the manuscript they're reviewing. So we'd ask you to have a look and see if the manuscript's got any glaring errors in terms of the literature support, and make sure that the citations and references that they've used are correct. And also we'd ask you to identify any significant gaps and potentially recommend some additional papers to authors. So when you're having a look at the aim of the paper or the research, really the big overview questions that we want you to think about are, is this piece of work actually adding anything to the body of evidence? So it's important to know, and that should be explained in their introduction, what the rationale for the paper is, why there's a gap in the knowledge, what this paper has to offer that's going to change people's practice, or at least inform any future changes. And this is really important, and in many ways this is the first thing you should be looking at, is if the findings of the paper don't actually make any difference to what we already know, or they're not going to change practice in any way, then why would we publish it? Okay, that's then therefore going to be a straight reject, and you've done your review. You need to provide a few comments saying this has already been covered, we already know this, it's not adding to the body of knowledge. And potentially you could try and think of some aspect of their paper that might be maybe further researched or worked on to try to change that. So that's a very important aspect of it, and that can really save you a lot of time and effort if you focus on that at the start. So moving forward now into the methods section, we'd ask you to have a look at how they've designed the methods, make sure you can understand what they've written, because if you can't understand it, then other readers are unlikely to as well. So that needs to be clear and logical, and increasingly we've got guidelines that we recommend as authors, for authors to use as they write their paper. So things like COREC and Prisma are good little guides to make sure that all of the relevant information is provided in a method. You need to have a think about whether the study design itself inherently introduces bias or limitations, and along with that, whether they've had ethical approval. Now, for a literature review, that's not, of course, that massively important, but for other things, particularly where human participants are involved, there should be a statement that there's been some ethical approval for the paper. And again, if there isn't, it's going to be really hard for us to publish that. Do have a look if there's any potential conflicts of interest within the method itself. So if it's been sponsored by some company and there's something in there that perhaps makes you think that there's some element of bias, that's really important that you annotate that in your feedback. And make sure that the methods they've used for data collection and analysis are appropriate. And ideally, we'd want that to be a validated method that somebody else has used successfully before, or if not, there needs to be really good narration about why they've chosen that particular method and what makes them confident that that's a good method to have used. For qualitative research, a lot of manuscripts don't put a huge amount of detail in about qualitative research, which is why the COREC guidelines are so useful for us. So do have a look if you're reviewing a qualitative paper. You're probably going to know all this if you're reviewing a qualitative paper. Just make sure that they've described the paradigm that they're approaching the work from, and their methodological approach, and in particular their data analysis method, in sufficient detail. Moving into the results section, again, this needs to be really clear, and a lot of authors do tend to just throw things into the results section, loads and loads of tables, loads and loads of figures, which is great, but sometimes less is more, and we don't really want to be publishing large amounts of tables, of huge amounts of data, when we can get away with a summary table and potentially suggest that some of the more detailed figures or tables go in as supplementary material. So supplementary material are things that are hosted on our journal's website but don't actually appear in the article itself. So as you're reading through an article, it may make reference to a figure or table or data that's in the supplementary material. And you can typically click on that and it will bring up the relevant data. And it makes the article very much less cluttered to read, but still enables that sharing of primary data in more detail than you could possibly allow if you allowed loads and loads of tables and figures in the manuscript itself. Do have a think about whether they have presented the results that they've purported to present. Make sure there's no glaring omissions and the data hasn't been cleansed a little bit. And do make sure they've cited. All the tables and figures need to have a little title and they need to be cited in the text. So something as seen in table 3, or figure 4 shows this or that. And we also hope that the figures are of sufficient quality, and that we just mean have a look at the resolution, and we'll make recommendations about that if they're below our standard. So the discussion and conclusion, again, some authors are content to throw loads of results in and then just write a very brief summary statement, but really we want there to be their interpretation of the findings, in particular in relation to other published data. So that's really important for readers to be able to see how their results do influence the body of knowledge in that field. It's very important when authors are writing discussion that they highlight what are the limitations that they have identified in their own work. And that's an important part of the critical approach, of course, is that authors identify the limitations to help the reader to set their work in the context. So have a look at the conclusion section as well, and they can sometimes be a little bit sort of tenuous, a bit generic. More research needs to be done in this field, that sort of thing, but they really should have specific a summary of the specific findings of the work, and very importantly, how that work and those findings are going to potentially influence practice. So ideally, we'd like some recommendations that the readers can take away rather than just repeating the results. So in this whole section, the discussion section, we expect the authors to talk about the implications of their work, the importance, the significance, allude to the published data and make these comparisons between their findings and those that are already out there, and both of those elements need to feed through into the conclusion section. Okay, we also do ask you to look at the writing style and presentation, make sure it's not too rambly, make sure there's no bits that are not clear at all, and generally have a look at whether the grammar, spelling and punctuation is appropriate. If they're not, please don't spend hours and hours annotating manuscripts with all of the typographical errors. I know some of our reviewers do that, which is great for the authors, but ideally we don't want you to be wasting your time on that. That's really the author's job. So we need to direct them to be able to find someone who can do that proofreading for them. Now, we do have some suggested services on the Cambridge University Press site where authors can use a professional proofreading service. So do feel free to recommend that they seek the services of a proofreader. And this is a common theme, shall we say, particularly because we're very, very keen to receive papers from as wide an international audience as possible. And it's really hard not writing in a language that's not your mother tongue. So in some of those cases, it's quite handy to be able to recommend a professional proofreading service that can really help with those. And really, just coming back to the overview, and this is sometimes a part of the conclusion, really, is that you have to be able to judge the significance of this piece of work. So it needs to be original, and it needs to be able to change practice. And again, those two things need to not only thread right the way through the sort of introduction and method section, but when we're looking at the discussion and conclusion section, it needs to be absolutely clear that they have made it clear to the reader why their results are important and how they can potentially change practice. And as before, if this work isn't going to change radiotherapy practice, we don't want to publish it. So this brings us to the decision. And this is really important. You've done all the hard work reviewing, you've identified what the limitations are, hopefully you've identified what's good about the paper as well. It's good to balance things. I've talked very much there about checking for things that might be dreadfully wrong with it, but alongside that, you also do need to have a look at what's really good. Is it really significant? Is it really novel? Is it a great method? Is it very robust? And those kind of things are nice to feed back to the authors, along with the litany of things they need to change. It gives a little bit of balance to it. So the decision's really important. And one of the main reasons we want to do this training session is because very often we get decisions that don't match with the feedback, and it makes it really hard to process these, because we're given this decision. It's really hard to override that decision. So making sure you tick that right box is absolutely crucial. So there's actually 5 decisions. We've got an straight accept, a minor revision, a major revision, and then we split our reject decision up into whether we don't want anything else related to this topic to come in, or whether the author might want to try rewriting it, whether we would accept that or not. So I'll talk about that as we get to that point. Accepts are really rare. They do happen, but what it basically means is that you can't think of anything wrong with this paper, you can't think of any suggestions to improve it. It's great as it is. Okay. Now, we sometimes get a decision that says accept and then a long list of suggestions, and that's not an accept. So the accept suggests very strongly that nothing else needs to be done. So if you're happy with the paper, or at least you'd be happy to accept it if things were changed, then it's not an accept. It means that it needs a revision. Okay, so an accept means they're not going to do anything else. If both reviewers accept it, we're just going to publish it as it is. Okay, so that's really, really important. Now, when we come to revisions, we make the distinction between a minor revision and a major revision. And part of that is due to the amount of work involved. But another important distinction is a minor revision doesn't tend to come back to you. So a minor revision are things that the editor will be checking. And that speeds things up, because if the editor does the check, we don't need to go through that process of recruiting reviewers again and waiting for that process to happen. So a minor revision is things that an editor can check have been changed. So this normally means that the revisions suggested relate to how the writing has been performed and how the study has been presented, and not the actual underlying study itself. So commonly this will be things where we need clarification. The text needs to be edited a bit. The authors need to provide some more sources of evidence to support what they're saying. They've potentially not used any evidence to support their methods, or commonly their discussion section. It might mean that they need to present or interpret their results a little more clearly. They might need to make some amendments to the conclusions, the abstract, and clarify methods. Say things that are all clarification and minor bits of changes, things that an editor can have a look at and say, oh yes, I can see that has been that's been amended fine. This would constitute a minor revision. And there can be loads and loads of these. There can be a great big long list of little things that need changing. If they're all to do with rewriting things, as little amendments that an editor can check, we'd still put that through as a minor revision. So a major revision implies that they need to do something to the study itself. Okay? And by that, what we mean is that they need to kind of change the focus of something. Maybe they need to tweak some of their methods, maybe add a different statistical test. That's quite common. They might have omitted something that's really important. There might be some ethical issues that need clarifying. So these kind of changes are things that the peer reviewers will need to see. So particularly where you've suggested that they've not considered something that's really important that you know about because you're an expert in the field. So a major revision requires them to undertake a lot more work to find lots of additional data, lots of additional methods, and potentially do a little bit of reanalysis of their work. Okay. Now, when we come to a reject decision, as I said, we've got two different aspects of that. So a rejection basically means that you can't change what you've written in our time frame and make this publishable. So a reject implies that there's something inherently wrong with the method. And if there's a problem, a methodological flaw, but the underlying study would be really interesting and it could be really, really useful, then we would potentially send out a reject and we'd encourage the authors to rewrite it and resubmit it. Now, you'd ask, why isn't that a major revision? The reason that's not a major revision is because the amount of time needed to redo the method, and bear in mind for some that'll need an amendment to their ethics submission, the amount of time is substantial compared to a major revision, which would hope they would be able to get done in 4 to 6 weeks. So submitting a decision of a reject and encouraging a rewrite just resets the time. So they've not got these constant reminders, we've not had your revision yet, for quite a long period of time. So it can be a good thing for the author and for the journal that we get rid of that paper and we start again. And when they're ready, when they've changed all of the details of the method or whatever they needed to change, they can submit as a new manuscript, and then we'd have a look at it through the whole peer review process again. So that's an important distinction. A major revision is something they can feasibly do and change. A reject and an encourage of a rewrite is something that's going to take quite a long period of time and will involve changing something about their method inherently. The reject without encouraging a rewrite usually is because there's nothing new in it, or it's not relevant to our journal. And for both of those, commonly the editor will pick those up first. So it's relatively rare that you get something that's irrelevant to the journal. That's part of the editor's process. We can also have a reject because there's no ethical permissions. And in some cases, if it's so badly written that you can't actually tell what's going on in it, and that does happen occasionally, it has to be a reject because it'll need a complete rewrite, but we don't know whether the methods are good or not because we simply can't understand them. So both of the reject decisions suggest that substantial additional work is needed, and for the reject, additional work, no matter what you do, is not going to make this suitable for publication. Okay, I really hope that clarifies things a little bit. The times when I have the most problem with decisions are when there's a rejection, but a list of things that could relatively easily be changed in the paper, which would imply it should be a revision. Or occasionally an accept accompanied by a list of revisions. So both of those causes a few problems. Now, you can always email me, email the editor, if you've got any queries or you're not sure about a decision. I'm more than happy to help with that situation. Okay, so finally get onto the feedback. So you've reviewed the paper, you've had a look at everything in good detail, and you're constructing some feedback for the author to accompany your decision. It's really important that you acknowledge how much effort it takes to submit a piece of work for publication. They've gone and done a huge amount of research and invested loads of time and effort in it. They've adhered to our guidelines, hopefully. They've written loads of words. They've worked on it really hard, and they've submitted it off. So we need to try to be kind. And being kind when we're submitting our feedback means acknowledging the positive aspects of their research. It's a really interesting paper. The methods are really innovative, very robust data analysis. The findings, we've got great potential for this to change practice. Those kind of things just acknowledge the amount of work that's gone into this. The focus really should be not necessarily on pointing out everything that's wrong, but pointing out things that could be improved. And rather than saying something's dreadful, identify what could be done to improve that particular section. And when we give feedback back to authors and we ask for a revision, we say you've got to provide evidence that you've either addressed each of the recommendations of the reviewer or provide a rebuttal, some reason why you've not done that. So it does help matters if you are making recommendations, specific recommendations that something else is added, something is changed, something is omitted, and that's really, really important. And again, do make sure that your feedback matches the decision. So if you've accepted the paper, you don't need to put any feedback. You can say, this was great, I enjoyed reading it, that kind of thing, but no suggestions for improvement. The revision, just bear in mind whether it's a minor or major revision. the amount of work that's going to go into the changes and who needs to look at those changes, in your opinion. And if it's a rejection, it can be handy to give them some ideas as to how they could improve things for the future, but we need to phrase that very clearly so they know that this isn't a list of things to do in terms of a revision. These are things that are the reason why we couldn't accept it. Okay, and wherever you can in the revisions, make sure you've got specific suggestions that they can definitely action. So some really good suggestions here for improvement. Any issues that there are in the study related to the methods or how they've analysed the data should be clearly stated, along with some suggestions to how they can be improved. Remember, if you're asking them to do little changes to the method, that can be really difficult for them. But changing how they analyse the data that they've got is something that they could very easily do as a revision. It's handy if you can suggest some areas where they should bring in more literature. Don't just say more evidence is needed. Try and say more evidence in relation to this particular theme or this topic, or to support these decisions that you've made. Do make sure that you suggest that they identify their limitations of their research in the discussion section. And that's something that some authors just omit. It's hard, really, isn't it, to identify what you've done badly, but that's a really important part of a critical process within authors' manuscripts. Highlight any areas where you think they need to provide additional data or clarify something, or just do a little bit more analysis. General suggestions related to how they could improve the flow. So I suggest this chunk of writing should appear earlier than this. That kind of thing's fine. But don't go through annotating spelling mistakes, please. It'll take you forever. Do feel free to suggest some more statistical methods in relation to the data analysis. Incidentally, if you're not hyper confident with stats, that's not a problem. You can just identify in your confidential comments to the editor that you're not entirely sure about the stats. And potentially the other reviewer may well have that experience and be able to look at the stats, or we can engage a statistician to provide that third level of review just on the statistical methods. So do feel free to acknowledge that if that's a challenge for you. You can also identify how they could potentially have interpreted the data, if there's any misconceptions in how they've interpreted the data, and how they can make their conclusions dynamite, how they can finish the whole paper off with highly specific conclusions and recommendations for practice. And the bottom two there. So anything that they might need to add to relates into their ethical clearance, and any citations that they've missed. And that kind of thing is picked up later on when we're about to publish the paper by our team there. But at this stage, it's quite handy to give the authors a heads up. It saves them time later. Okay, that's all I wanted to say in terms of guidance for peer review. We do offer a moderation exercise, and for that you'll need you need to email and or accept the invitation if you've been invited. And what we'll do there is a little seminar, and prior to that you're asked to review a dummy manuscript. So you'll have a look at the manuscript, you submit some comments and a decision, and then we all get together in a little seminar and discuss the decisions, discuss the feedback. It's a really useful way of sharing practice and making sure that we're all on the same page. So I do hope you'll consider doing that. Do let me know. My email address is on the journal website, and let me know if you're interested in this and we can sign you up. Okay, thank you so much, not only for engaging with the peer review training session today, but also for engaging with peer review. It's, as I said at the start, an incredibly important part of the journal's work. It's a really important part of evidence-based practice and supporting our beloved profession and making sure that we're publishing the best output and findings that we can. I hope you enjoy peer reviewing with us, and I'll be in touch in the near future, hopefully.